Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa. Welcome to the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect the horror genre and all the things that scare us. This episode is a special interview with writer Ruth Franklin. Ruth Franklin is a book critic who has contributed to the New Yorker, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, and the New York Review of Books. Her first book, A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. She recently published a well-received biography of Shirley Jackson with Live Right Publishing Company. This biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, was a New York Times notable book and appears on Best of 2016 lists from Time, Entertainment Weekly, NPR, and the Boston Globe.
While many people only know of Shirley Jackson because the lottery might have scarred them as a young reader, or because they loved The Haunting of Hill House, these two works barely scratch the surface of Jackson's literary output, which included 6 novels for adults, 3 books for children, a short story collection, and 2 collections of comic sketches about domestic life, not to mention reams of stories for popular magazines of the day. Ms. Franklin's biography brings well-deserved and long overdue attention to Jackson's whole career with a thoughtful exploration of Jackson's life and her writing, paying careful attention to the conflicts between the two that being a married woman with a career in the 1950s created.
Here at the No Fear Cast, we eagerly anticipated her biography, and we enjoyed reading it. We were also lucky enough to get to have a discussion with Ruth Franklin about one of our favorite writers.
The first thing that we wanted to ask you about is, why did you decide to write a biography of Shirley Jackson? Like, what drew you to her as a subject?
Sure. Well, she's one of those authors who I always kind of had in the back of my mind as, one of my personal touchstones, especially The Haunting of Hill House. I know everybody reads The Lottery in high school and remembers it, but for me, it was actually The Haunting of Hill House that was the one that always lingered in my mind. But, I actually didn't decide to write the biography until I had read more of her stuff, especially the domestic memoirs, and got a better sense of her range. And it was especially reading those books and getting a sense of what Jackson's life might actually have been like as a woman in the 1950s who had this constant struggle with being a housewife and a mother on the one hand and being a creative artist on the other. And that was what really made me intrigued by her life and want to find out more about it.
That's really interesting. The Haunting of Hill House was what got me interested in her, even though I had read The Lottery. Lisa, I know you were interested in asking about the domestic sketches. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I started with The Lottery, of course, like most people, and then The Haunting of Hill House, and then I moved into We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And by that point, I wanted to read more by Jackson, and I got to her domestic sketches, and they seemed so out of place at first when I read them with the rest of her stuff. And I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because when I learned more about her life, she did seem to live this very dual life of like this intellectual bohemian almost, but then a wife and a mother. And yeah, I was wondering if you could just add a little bit to that.
Sure. I mean, yeah, she did kind of have this double life, at least as far as her career was concerned, where she wrote these, serious literary works, these works of dark suspense like The Lottery and many of her other short stories, and of course the great novels. And then on the other hand, she turned out these very cheerful, lighter comic sketches about, her 4 charming children and all the mischievous antics that they got up to. And what's interesting is that actually Jackson had a huge following for these works during her lifetime, because she published all these pieces initially as articles in women's magazines that were very popular, like Good Housekeeping and Woman's Home Companion. And this actually was part of the engine of her career, because it was what allowed her to be the family breadwinner. She actually made more money than her husband for almost all of her career. And it was her salary that kept the family going. So, not only were these a very lucrative outlet for her and a popular one, but I also think they were a way that she honed her style. One thing that we tend not to think about is the comic side of Jackson. And yet, even a novel like The Haunting of Hill House has, a real comic edge that, kind of takes a little bit of the sting, I think, out of the terror of the rest of the story.
Yeah, I just finished teaching The Haunting of Hill House, and one of my students was struck by the humor in it. He was talking about how you could be reading this and be scared, and all of a sudden she has this just wacky character, or just this kind of remark that makes you laugh out loud, even though you're reading a haunted house piece.
Right. There's this, this whole very funny sequence involving the Ouija board reader.
Yes.
Right. Dr. Montague's wife, the ghost hunter's wife, and her, misguided efforts to try to control the spirits in Hill House. It's hilarious.
After she talks to spirits, she needs crackers and milk, I think, is like one of the things.
Right?
Yeah. I know. When I talk to ghosts, I need crackers and milk.
I mean, you can't do that sort of thing on an empty stomach, I think, in general. Also very Shirley Jackson touch, I think, her maternal instinct for providing the snacks.
Oh, and her humor always has a slight edge to it, too, like you were saying, because what is it, the story, which I think you mentioned in the bio, and a lot of people talk about, the third baby's the easiest, I think, where the nurse is asking her occupation. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, but there's that edge of, like, the nurse won't let her say she's a writer. She has to be the housewife. Yeah.
Exactly, right. She's checking into the hospital to deliver her third baby. And the nurse asks for her occupation. And another thing that's so striking about the story is it's written just a few months after the lottery was published, which was when Jackson had her third child. So, of course, when she's asked for her occupation, she says writer. She's just written the most sensational short story in America. And the clerk says, I'll just put down housewife. And the dialogue actually is repeated, as in case we didn't get it the first time. They go through the whole writer housewife thing again, and it's such a trenchant little story, I think, that says so much about what it must have been like to be a woman like Shirley Jackson and trying to be a writer when everybody around her expected her just to be a housewife.
I'm just curious, do you think that contributed, and I'm not asking you like diagnose or anything, but do you think that double life contributed to her anxiety issues?
Yeah, I definitely think so. It's, I do want to avoid the tendency to posthumously make diagnoses, but it's clear that Jackson suffered from a lot of anxiety issues, especially at a couple different points in her life when they seem to have been exacerbated by either circumstances in her life or the stuff that she was working on at the moment. And I do think that tension between the two roles is readable beneath the surface of so much of her work.
Yeah, when I started learning more about her life, and I think it struck me just because I'm a writer and a wife, and I'm a mother to 2 young kids, and so I read a lot of myself and my life and her life. And I can't imagine trying to be doing the same thing in the 1950s when women were expected to be the more traditional housewife role. But I'm wondering, I look at her now from a contemporary viewpoint, and I almost see her as this feminist icon. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, did she see herself at all in that way? Did she have an idea of, I'm really breaking out of this mold?
Well, first of all, I sympathize also with what you say. I'm the mother of 3 and obviously also a writer, and I can't imagine doing it at a time when there was even less support for it than there is now, right?
Right.
But, I don't think she did see herself as a feminist icon. I think maybe if she had lived a little bit later or a little bit longer, that might have been clear to her. I think she just saw herself as a woman who was very much of her era, who is also engaged in, a practice that didn't always look very feminist on the surface, running a household and literally taking care of her husband, who didn't know how to do anything around the house, including, even make coffee, and who didn't do anything for the children at all, really, until they were basically old enough to read and write. And, I think the word feminist would have been used in a much different way then than it is now. And I don't think that Jackson identified herself that way or really identified with any kind of political movement at all. She was always very apolitical. One thing that's surprised me a little bit is the pushback against my own reading of Jackson as a kind of feminist icon, if you will, by people who say, that she, wasn't really a feminist, or that her work isn't really feminist, and so it's limiting to read it that way, and other stuff. I think there's still a kind of a resistance to seeing her in that light. And of course, Betty Friedan actually calls her out in The Feminine Mystique as kind of a traitor to feminism. Really ironic, funny in a very biting way, in that she puts Jackson in the same category as Jean Kerr and some other what she calls housewife writers, and compares them to Amos and Andy for making a joke out of, a very serious and negative situation, which I just think is so unfair. I think that she's not reading between the lines, and she's not seeing how kind of subtly subversive Jackson's housewife writing actually is, because she never actually holds herself up to this ideal of being a perfect housewife. She's quick to emphasize how she falls short, how she is a bad housekeeper and her children are running aimlessly around the neighborhood while she's sitting at home doing, she doesn't say what, but we could assume she's sitting at home writing her stories. And in fact, her mother, who was always very critical of her for not living up to that kind of standard, her mother criticized her for portraying her domestic life in such a chaotic way in these stories, and said nobody's going to want to read them if you describe your way of living as so helter-skelter. But of course, it was something that many of Jackson's readers found very relatable.
Yeah, I don't remember which domestic book it was in, but I remember the story of one of her children having to run down the street to another friend's mom in order to get breakfast.
Right. Yeah, there's a story in which she clearly is kind of sleeping off a hangover, and when she wakes up, all the children are gone, and she has to track them down.
I always really liked that. But when I read in the biography about her own childhood with her mother, there is a very stark difference between how her mother tried to raise her and who her mother tried to shape her into being, and the mother that Shirley Jackson ended up portraying, at least herself, to be in her books.
Right. Her mother, was very prim and proper and a socialite, and wanted her to, be a debutante and grow up to be a socialite, just like she was. And it was clear from the beginning that Jackson just wasn't going to fulfill that role. And one of my favorite finds, actually, from her archive was this diary that I mentioned in the biography. And it was in a notebook that had on its cover the picture of a very proper young lady with pearl necklace and nicely waved hair. And someone, can only assume the teenage Shirley Jackson, had taken a pencil and just scratched out the face of this girl. And the name of the picture written underneath is The Debutante. And that seemed like it said so much about Jackson's feelings about her desire to fulfill her mother's expectations. And, so they butted heads over that sort of thing when Jackson was a teenager, and it lasted for the rest of her life. Her mother constantly sent her these very, very critical letters at really the slightest provocation that are just painful to read.
Yeah, the letter her mother sends her about that photograph that she saw later in her life. How could you let yourself look that way? I mean, that just seems so devastating to me.
Oh, just awful. And of course, it's about, she doesn't even mention the wonderful review of We Have Always Lived in the Castle that the photograph was illustrating.
Which in some ways I think shows that she kind of anticipated some of the body image issues that are, have become more prominent and talked about lately, even in addition to her domestic and family stories as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to see her kind of going back and forth on her weight in her writing, both the published writing and the private writing. A lot of her letters are filled with, stuff about her diets and the diet doctor she visits and, the magic diet pills that he gives her. And she actually saved these diet logs, which are actually in her archive at the Library of Congress, where she tracked her meals for, years and years on end, really. And, along with her weight, so you can see the way it fluctuates, which of course is now what we think of as yo-yo dieting, which we know now is so unhealthy, right, and stressful for the heart. And I'm sure it contributed to Jackson's early death.
One of the things that's kind of become a bone of contention, I guess, amongst Jackson critics is her ties to magic and her interest in the occult. Seems to go back and forth from, the kind of treating her as this quote-unquote witch-like character as it was in one of her first bios, to just a passing kind of scholarly interest. And I'm just interested, what did you find in your research about her relation to that, her ideas about magic and fiction and how the occult informed her work?
Well, I found it very, very hard to pin down. I mean, there certainly is a lot in her private papers about her interest in witchcraft and the occult from an early age, from college, really. Letters describing, the time when she first gets her first pack of tarot cards, and the witchcraft chronicles in the library, rare books from the 16th or 17th century that she is checking out and really very carefully perusing for information. And, of course, she was a serious scholar of witchcraft and magic for her whole life and had an impressive library of all these books. Does this mean that she actually was a practitioner of witchcraft? I think the jury is still out on that, and it's impossible to tell by looking at her papers. But there's no doubt in my mind that it was something that she took very, very seriously. If maybe not literally as a magical practice that she engaged in, because it is quite clear from her work that she's very skeptical about religion and spirituality expressed in any way. And of course, so was her husband, Stanley Hyman, who was really a militant atheist. So I think you have to consider that. But at the same time, even if it wasn't something that she actually practiced, and, frankly, I'm not 100% sure that it wasn't, it certainly was an interest that she took very seriously as a metaphor, as I write, for ways in which women have traditionally channeled power. And part of what has always made men quite terrified of women is, the ways in which they're able to put this power to use. So, I wouldn't downplay it at all as a very serious interest, but I question how literally Jackson means for us to take it.
And I thought it was interesting how at one point you connect her interest in magic to writing fiction. The story about the refrigerator that she wrote, where it's like you could use magic to fix the refrigerator, but she wrote a story and it made the money to buy a new refrigerator.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think that's, an example of, obviously a tongue-in-cheek way in which she talked about magic, but also it is an example of the metaphorical quality.
Right.
Oh, look, presto, she waves her wand and she gets a new refrigerator. There's also a wonderful line in that essay we talked about a little earlier, The Third Baby's the Easiest, where she quotes a line from Othello about, in which he's describing the way that he makes Desdemona fall in love with him by telling all the tales that he tells her of his, adventures in faraway lands. And she doesn't quote the next line, but it's so famous that I feel like you can almost kind of hear it ringing in the text afterwards. And the line, of course, is, "That is the only witchcraft I have used." And I think that is striking in and of itself, that there's that reference to witchcraft and storytelling as intimately linked.
Yeah, writing fiction is a type of magic in a way, creating a new reality.
Mm. Right, of course.
How did, or maybe it didn't, I don't know, but do you feel like her interest in that kind of led to some of her feelings of being an outsider when she lived particularly in small towns?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say if that led to her feeling like an outsider or if it was the fact that she felt like an outsider that was part of what brought her to witchcraft and magic. I mean, yeah, I think she felt like that very early on, not fitting in the very Tony suburb, Burlingame, California, where she was raised. And then, of course, later on, when her family lived in North Bennington, Vermont, and were very much outsiders in that town, not only as, Stanley Hyman, of course, was Jewish, as faculty at the college, they were, politically very different from their neighbors who were mostly very conservative. And then, of course, Jackson as a writer was always very different from those around her. So I think it's maybe kind of a chicken and the egg question, but there's no doubt that she did always feel like an outsider, more or less wherever she was.
Well, that does seem to kind of circle back, especially, you mentioned her not fitting in even in early life, but her not fitting into that idea of what her mother thought she should be. There's the quotation in your book where she says that the first novel is written to get back at your parents, and then you can begin your real writing.
Yeah.
And I always found that interesting because I guess when I read her distrust of society in general throughout her work, that quotation struck me as interesting because I wonder if she ever really did get over that getting back at her parents.
You mean you think maybe all the other novels were written to get back at her parents?
I wonder if there wasn't a little dig in a few of those.
Yeah, well, who can blame her?
Right.
But, certainly the first one does seem like it's kind of more pointed in that it actually describes this neighborhood in Burlingame. Of course, in the novel, she calls it something different, but it's clearly Burlingame, California, down to the actual houses on the street where she grew up. And it's just this incredibly satiric, very bitter picture of this neighborhood and the pettiness of all the people who live on this block. And, not only are they petty and mean to each other, but they're totally neglectful of their children who sort of run ragged around the block, also committing all kinds of heinously cruel acts that the parents seem not to care less about at all. So, if she meant that as a portrait of her childhood, I think it really is quite devastating.
This is kind of changing the subject slightly, but I'm curious, the letters that you found from, was it Jean Beatty, to and from her? Lisa and I were talking, there's already, the early 1970s biographical information in Friedman's book. And then, of course, you have Judy Oppenheimer's Private Demons. I was just wondering, what do you think these letters, add to our picture of Jackson as a writer and as a person?
Sure. Well, the backstory is that I found Jean Beatty's letters to Jackson in Jackson's archive at the Library of Congress. And when I started reading them, I just became fixated on tracking down the letters from Jackson that they had been written in response to, because these letters just were so smart and witty. And also from reading them, I could tell that Jackson was writing to this woman, Jean Beatty, about things that she really hadn't written about to anybody else, especially her writing process on We Have Always Lived in the Castle. These letters actually spanned just about the exact time period of when Jackson was working on that book. And there really wasn't very much known about her process or the drafts that the book went through, because the drafts actually aren't in Jackson's archive. They're held privately by her family. So I became determined to track down Jean Beatty. And unfortunately, it turned out that she had died not long before I found her letters. But eventually, with the help of her daughter, I actually was able to find the letters that Jackson had written to her, which had been kept all this time in her barn in Pennsylvania. So it turned out to be about 60 pages of letters. Some of them were single-spaced, and it was an intense correspondence that went on, maybe a few times a month for about a year and a half, and then gradually dwindled. Started, incidentally, by a fan letter that Jean Beatty wrote to Jackson after reading a little piece that she had written in a magazine about the Oz books and her lifelong love of them. So, first of all, I just thought it was so amazing that this intense friendship could have been sparked just by a simple piece of fan mail, of which, Jackson got tons. And, certainly she didn't respond to all of it. She must have recognized something in Jean's letter right away that showed that she was a kind of kindred spirit. In terms of what they add, first, I think it's just so telling that at this point in her life, we're talking about the end of 1959, beginning of 1960 was when this correspondence started. Jackson, the author of 5 novels, The Haunting of Hill House, has just been a big success. But she was quite lonely. And, of course, she had this very intense and enmeshed, but also very troubled marriage to Stanley Hyman. And I think she did not have many female friends, at least, not friends whom she really felt she could confide in. The other women in North Bennington, the ones she was friendly with, were really other faculty wives, the wives of other professors at Bennington College, whom she socialized with a lot, but I think didn't have intimate friendships with. So, it shows how lonely she was, that all it took was, this one letter to spark this intense relationship. And then the way she writes about what was going through her mind when she was working on We Have Always Lived in the Castle was really what I found so fascinating. Not just all the details of her domestic life, and the letters really are quite detailed about, her children and her pets. She even sent Jean a photograph of a whole bunch of her pets, but also her anxiety about We Have Always Lived in the Castle and the struggles she went through in the beginning when she was working on that book to try to get it started. And that was actually a pretty common theme. Jackson always had trouble writing her novels at first, and usually had lots of false starts where she, would wind up abandoning her draft or rewriting everything from a different perspective, in the voice of a different character than she originally started in. But my sense was for We Always Lived in the Castle, it actually was even more difficult than usual. And she told Jean at one point that she was abandoning the whole novel, that she was just going to throw it all out and move on to something else. And so I think she used these letters really as an outlet for, her personal frustration and also for her writing frustration. And, being able to express that was part of what helped her finally get the novel on track and finish it in a way that she was, of course, eventually very, very satisfied with it. I think, in fact, she believed that it was her best novel, as do so many other people. Mm-hmm. So I found the letters to be revealing in many different ways.
Do you think, especially thinking about the fragment Come Along With Me, that Jackson's work was about to take a sharp kind of turn before she passed away?
It's so hard to say, especially because Come Along With Me has been published in what was a very early draft form. And, as I just said, Jackson tended to revise so heavily that the first draft of a novel was almost never anything like what wound up in the final version. So I think that makes it especially hard to say. All of her novels are really strikingly different from each other. They're all basically in different genres, in different voices, in different styles. So, it's hard to say whether Come Along With Me would have been indicative of a general turn or development in Jackson's style, or just simply her trying on a new voice.
You make a really good point, because all of her work is very different when you compare it to the rest, but she does have a very distinctive voice. I feel like when you read something, it's Shirley Jackson. And I'm wondering, because there does seem to be such a renewed interest in her recently, what it is that's resonating with contemporary readers in her work.
Well, I think part of it is, as you say, her voice. It's so distinctive. And I think there is something that feels very contemporary about it. Jackson's work isn't really marked by the technical indications of when it's taking place. It feels kind of both out of time and timeless. So, it can be read as very much up to the moment. There's nothing in We've Always Lived in the Castle that would make us think that it might not be taking place right now. So, I think she does have that kind of time shifting quality. But more than that, I think there is an acceptance and a desire right now to read about the kind of stuff that Jackson was writing about. The critics of her time tended to dismiss or undervalue her work. And I believe that it's not, as is often argued, because she was a genre writer, because, as I said, I don't think she was a genre writer. She wrote in all kinds of different styles and genres. But because her writing was so focused on women's lives and the issues of women's lives. There's so few even male protagonists in her work. And I think the male critics of her time simply were not ready to regard that as meaningful or important. And I think, we have reached a moment. Sometimes it feels like one step forward, two steps back, I suppose. But, I think there is obviously a lot more interest in women's writing in our current cultural moment, and women fiction writers are indeed taken very seriously. So I think that's part of the reason, why Jackson's resurgence feels particularly relevant.
Well, we were wondering if you had a favorite Jackson story, either a fictional one or maybe even something just from her life or about her as a person that you would like to share.
Yeah, it's so hard. I guess, I have a bunch of favorite stories. One of my very favorites, and this definitely is a less read Jackson story, is the one that was published, and was published actually under two titles, sometimes called A Visit and also sometimes called The Lovely House. And it's a kind of a ghost story that feels in some ways like a precursor to The Haunting of Hill House, in which a girl goes to visit a friend of hers at the friend's country house for the summer. And there she develops a relationship with someone whom she believes is her friend's brother. And it becomes clear by the end of the story that's not quite who he is at all. But I feel like it kind of does the story injustice to even try to summarize it, because a lot of its magic is just the beautiful way that it's written and the haunting imagery, and also the sense of this great ambiguity that the reader is never quite certain exactly what's going on. For me, that's actually really the hallmark of Jackson's style, is that amazing ambiguity. You know, whether it's The Haunting of Hill House, where we can't ever really be sure whether the ghosts are meant to be actual supernatural manifestations or different people's psychological manifestations, or in We've Always Lived in the Castle, where the actions are quite clear, but it's the motives that are totally opaque. And of course, I could give so many other examples from her work, but this, you know, the way that she manages to sustain the tension of this ambiguity, I think, is a lot of what makes her work so compelling. It makes you just want to go back and read it over and over again.
The Lovely House is a really great story. And Jackson is so good with ambiguity. Even when she gives you a turn in the story, you still, even after the shocker that she gives you, you still are not quite sure what's going on. It's just,
exactly.
You're right.
That actually happened. Am I sure that happened?
Which makes it fun to teach sometimes, but...
I bet. Yeah. Do you teach that story?
I actually do. And the sad thing is I've thought about stopping teaching The Lovely House, sadly, just because the students will sometimes just get angry about the ambiguity in that story. Even though there'll be a couple who will kind of get the fact that, yeah, it's not the guy that she thinks it is, but then they'll just be like, I don't understand, are these people ghosts? Are they alive? Are they dead? You know, I've had a lot more students really enjoy The Haunting of Hill House, but I still like to teach The Lovely House just because I think you're right. I mean, there's this kind of almost precursor to Haunting of Hill House, you know, feeling about it. But yeah, the lottery always gets students too, because people don't seem to read it in high school anymore. So in college, you'll get that, oh my God, what's happening? How is this happening? You know, reaction.
Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting how people tend to get angry sometimes the first time they read Jackson's stories. That was the response of so many of the initial readers to the lottery.
Yes.
Was to write these angry letters wanting to know what on earth it meant.
Right.
I think it's funny that you're still getting a similar reaction from your students so many years later.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, they still want to know what does it mean. And I think perhaps that's why she's so good at writing the inner lives of women, because there is so much ambiguity there, and most women are not one thing or another, but kind of a mixture of everything, and it really lends itself beautifully to that, even if some readers are going to be angered by the fact that they can't pigeonhole it into one thing or another.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, you know, of course, Jackson had to live with her own ambiguity of what actually her role was supposed to be. And, you know, I think probably that's also why her work seems so resonant now is, you know, we feel like, or at least for a while, it seemed like maybe we had all those problems solved, but then also it seems like as you grow up and you get older and you have kids, it turns out that, in fact, all that ambiguity is still there. It's just in a different form.
Well, Mel, did you have any further questions? Because I think I got just about everything.
No, I don't have any. I was just pondering ambiguity there for a second. But...
Well, I feel like we've lived this whole interview in ambiguity because I kept having to put my microphone on mute with my 4-year-old.
That's appropriate. Haven't we at one point or another during an interview?
Okay.
No, thank you so much for your time. And the biography is marvelous. And I'm glad that people are still reading Jackson and talking about her.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on your podcast. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This is the No Fear podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fearcast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes, or you can support us on Patreon. Supporters get exclusive access to mini episodes released on the weeks in between our normal schedule. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.